Before we dive into into this topic of what's so special about Israel, and I guess that's the fundamental question that we will be trying to answer during this session. What's so special about Israel? How did Israel became a startup nation, recognized worldwide? If you don't mind, share with us a bit about yourself, about your story, about how did what your experience with Israel.
My experience with Israel. Okay. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. And I see that my dear friend Tal Brody is here on the line, and my dear friend Dana Berger is here on the line, and I'm hoping that we'll get a chance to engage in conversation with everybody. I prepared a few slides. But if you want it to be a conversation, it's actually perfectly fine with me. Would you like me to show the slides and then we'll open the discussion?
Absolutely, we can do it this way as well.
All right, great. So, but you need to let me share the screen, and I think you'll find some of the most of the answers to your questions in the slide. But I will be more than happy to to open this for your questions. So, can you enable me to share the screen? All right.
Okay.
All right. So here we are. All right. So you can all see this. So, we just celebrated our 72nd birthday. And when you look at the opportunities versus the threats Israel is facing, obviously, I will talk a lot about the opportunities, but we also should remember the threats. Israel is facing an unprecedented number of challenges, but unlike in past years where most of the challenges were either physical and external, today we're also looking at some challenges that are conceptual, meaning intangible, and they're not necessarily external, they're also internal. A little bit of history, because it's very important to understand the roots of the so-called startup nation. And the reason why I'm using it, the so-called startup nation, is because, startup nation is a nice tagline, but Israel is way more than that. Israel is a hub of creativity in all walks of life, and technology is only one aspect. When you look at, this is the map of the war of independence between May 15th, 1948 to June 10th. What's striking about this map, and you see in red arrows the Arab forces attacking the Jewish forces, is the striking asymmetry. The enemy had way more soldiers, was 110,000 versus 55,000, representing 6 well-organized, relatively well-organized, and definitely better equipped military forces. They had more ammunition, they had better weapon system, they had international support, which is the tiny state of Israel did not have. Just to give you one example, this is the cover of Life magazine from the end of May of 1948. They sent a couple of reporters to write about the War of Independence, and the reporters concluded that the state of Israel, the Israeli independence, was nothing more than just an experiment. They concluded that it's an experiment that is doomed to fail. And just to make the point, Israel, can you imagine that the rebirth of the Jewish people in their ancient homeland after 2,000 years of exile wasn't good enough for the editors of Life magazine to give us the cover. The cover went that month to Doris Day, and the story about Israel and the War of Independence was buried inside the magazine. Ben-Gurion's first decision was to establish the Israel Defense Forces, and the emphasis is on the word defense. Why did he do that? It was important for him to make sure that he brings all 4 different paramilitary groups under the same umbrella so that he will be able to exercise his authority as a prime minister. That was his first decision of the permanent government, which he headed. And as you can see, this is the emblem of the IDF. And right here, you see that sword and the word Haganah. The reason is because the IDF was built on the foundation of the Haganah. The Haganah was the main paramilitary group in pre-statehood Palestine, between 50,000 to 55,000 men and women, including my parents, by the way. Simultaneously, a unit which was like the elite unit, if you may, of the Haganah, affiliated with them. You can see again by the symbols that they used. Palmach, with about 5,000 to 6,000 men and women. All the legendary names like Moshe Dayan and Yitzhak Rabin and Yigal Alon, and they were all members of the Palmach. And then on the other political side, you had Menachem Begin's Irgun, which was active from 1931 to 1948. The Haganah was established in 1920, by the way. That at its height, at its peak, had about 2,500 people. And the Stern Gang, which had even less, a few hundreds, but all four of them were brought together under one umbrella, the Israel Defense Forces. When you look at the nation building strategy, it's very, very clear that it's true that technically Israel was founded in 1948, but the truth is that the institutions of pre-statehood Israel were built many decades before independence. And in fact, we recently had our annual Memorial Day, the Yom HaZikaron, and when you look at the way the Israeli security establishment is counting our dead, the people who died, so that we'll be able to celebrate our independence and thrive, we begin the count in the year 1860. Why? Because it was the year when the Jews came out of the walls of the old city and built the first Jewish neighborhood in Jerusalem called Yamin Moshe. That's also when the friction between the Jews and the Arabs started. And so we count our dead from 1860. This is the official count. And when you look again at the national infrastructure that was built as early as 1920 with the creation of the Haganah, with the creation of the trade union, Maccabi World Union was established in 1921 in what is now the Czech Republic. The Hebrew University was established in 1925. Betzalel School of Art, by the way, in 1906. The Jewish Agency was established in 1929, which was the government of pre-statehood Palestine. And as I said before, the Palmach was established in 1941. Now, every nation has a national ethos. And here I'm beginning the discussion about the roots of Israeli creative spirit. In the United States, for example, the national ethos is called the American dream. Well, it's kind of difficult to speak about the American dream these days when America is going up in flames, but the founders of America basically were able to share a very compelling narrative. And that narrative was that if you are willing to work hard, if you are willing to be a law-abiding citizen, if you are willing to be a decent human being, then the sky is the limit. You can achieve everything and anything because America is the land of opportunity. That's the national ethos of the United States. And of course, it was complemented with robust legal system presented by the Constitution, with the spirit of freedom, and so on and so forth. Our national ethos, because of a long history of persecution that did not start in the 20th century, our national ethos forcefully after 1945 was never again. Israel's strategic dilemma has been since 1945 how to prevent a second Auschwitz. And just as we were beginning to fully comprehend what had happened to the Jews in Europe, that's when the Arab League decided to enact the Arab economic boycott, which was an all-encompassing attempt to suffocate the tiny nearly non-existent Jewish economy in pre-statehood Palestine. You have to understand, we had no industry in 1945, very little agriculture, no natural resources, and yet the Arabs were at that particular moment of weakness in our history, they were adamant and determined to suffocate the small Jewish community. How did we react? Three things under the leadership of David Ben-Gurion. The first was obvious. Israel had to develop new markets elsewhere. Until this very day, as you all know, we don't do business with our immediate neighbors. Where do we have the new markets? Where did we find them? We found them, first of all, in Europe, which until this very day is Israel's largest trade partner. We found the new markets in Asia, in North America, and at times also in Africa. The second thing that happened was the establishment of a massive operation and infrastructure that is based on charity and on the sales of bonds. In 1951, Ben-Gurion launches the State of Israel bonds, which actually is an enterprise built on the promise that Israel represented, because back in 1951, we were experiencing severe austerity, economic austerity. Israel had no money, had no natural assets. And when people buying bonds, they were actually not investing in what Israel had at the time, but in the promise of what Israel might have one day. And of course, because of no international aid, we did not have international aid from the United States, nor did we have it from the Soviet Union. The only people that were helping us were world Jewry and specifically American Jewry. That's where most of the money came from. And then the third thing that happened as a result of the Arab economic boycott is the design of Israel's economy as early as 1945 as a knowledge-based economy. And these are the roots of the so-called startup nation. So what are the unique building blocks of the startup nation? The first is a strong sense of urgency. We all know the old cliche, necessity is the mother of all invention. In the case of Israel, it's 100% correct. Then there is a very healthy interface between the academic world and then the business world. For example, Technion, which is a small university in American terms, only 12,000 students, 60% of the 5,500 startups that Israel produced come from Technion, the CEOs come from Technion. There's a very generous and systematic government support system. There is a culture of informality which allows people to ask questions, not to be afraid to ask questions. There's a culture of problem solving, meaning every problem has a solution. There is a built-in inherent refusal to accept limitations. And there's a very strong engine of creativity coming out of the military. And I would add to all of that the fact that in Israel, we are being taught to tolerate failure, not to celebrate failure, but to tolerate failure in every aspect of our lives. We have here Tal Brody, who experienced many championships, but also many failures. And that's the spirit of the Israelis. A story that is very little known. Albert Einstein, who was the biggest Jewish celebrity of the 20th century, was recruited to the Zionist movement by Dr. Chaim Weizmann, was his friend, who convinced him to come with him to New York in 1918 to raise money to what would later become the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And indeed, in 1923, after he raised millions for the university, Albert Einstein came to a barren hill outside of Jerusalem, and where is today Mount Scopus, to break ground for what would be the Hebrew University 2 years later in 1925. Sigmund Freud was there with him, Martin Buber was there with him, Yehuda Leib Magnus, Chaim Weizmann, and other luminaries of the Jewish people. So Chaim Weizmann asked Albert Einstein to become the first chairman of the board of the Hebrew University. It's a story that many people don't know. In 1955, when Albert Einstein died, he left everything that he had to the Hebrew University and not to any other institution that touched his life. And that's a remarkable thing. That's a remarkable thing. So Albert Einstein, if you may, is the father of Israeli academic prowess. And there is no startup nation without Israeli academic excellence. We have 10 research universities in Israel. In China, there is an index called the Shanghai Index, which ranks the top 500 universities in the world every year based on the number of publications and so on. Of the 10 research universities, you see here the top 6 of them are regularly ranked in the top 400 universities in the world. The top 4 universities here are regularly ranked in the top 200 in the world, and the top 2, Hebrew U and Technion, are regularly in the top 100, and they alternate between them. The top 50 last year was Technion, the year before it was Hebrew University, and for a nation of 9 million people, to have 60% of its university institutions ranked in the top list in the world. So you understand, in the United States alone, you have 5,500 universities. And we have in Israel only 10 universities. 6 of them are really ranked at the top of the top. Another reason for the startup nation is Israel's diversity and Israel's inclusive growth. What do I mean by inclusive growth? Look at this. In 1948, there were 650,000 people here. When I was born in 1962, there were about 2.5 million. 1973, 3.5 million, now 9 million, and we're projected to become 17 million by the time Israel will celebrate 100 years. That's a remarkable achievement. The biggest achievement of them all is the fact that the young state of Israel, with no money, with no resources, with no international support other than the support of the world Jewish community, was able to bring the Jews from the Arab and the Muslim world within the 6 years between 1952 to 1958. Now, it was not an easy task, not for those who came and not for those who had to prepare everything for them. It was a very difficult time in the history of the state of Israel. But when you look at the performance of Israel today, you must bring into consideration the fact that we have in Israel today no less than 120 different ethnic groups represented, no less than 80 languages that are regularly spoken. A lot of people don't know, for example, that Israel is a member of the Francophonic Association of countries that speak French, because we have nearly 750,000 Israelis that their first language is French. We have about 1 million Israelis that their first language is Russian. We have about 200,000 Israelis that their first language is English, like Tal Brody and my wife, and so on and so forth. And this diversity, this celebration, this mixture, this blend creates a tremendous creative spirit. Security is a big part of the startup nation. Israel's security doctrine stands on 3 legs. The first is the need to have a strong army, and the IDF is not only strong, it's also big in absolute numbers. The second leg is the need to prevent your enemy from executing his or her plan, their plan. And the way we do it usually is by striking preemptively. That's what happened during the 6-Day War. That's what happened in Iraq when Israel went out to destroy the Iraqi nuclear reactor. That's what happened in 2006. That's what's happening now in Syria when Israel is attacking Iranian targets, just to make sure that we are able to preemptively strike the enemy. But the third leg, perhaps the most important and the most creative leg, the leg that is linked to Startup Nation, is the leg that says that in order for Israel to succeed and to thrive, we need to deter our enemies. How do we deter our enemies? By developing weapon systems that are so creative, that are so mighty, that are so sophisticated that the enemy will shy away from us. And where this idea came from, Ben-Gurion, 1945, looked at how the war ended. The war ended with 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. And believe it or not, in the midst of the challenge of establishing the state of Israel, in the midst of the challenge to fight the Arab economic boycott, in the midst of the challenge to absorb nearly 1 million refugees, Jewish refugees from Arab and Muslim countries, Ben-Gurion is fantasizing about acquiring this imaginary weapon. Can you believe that? What kind of vision this person had to even think about that as a solution for the never again national ethos? Remember, the task is never again. So what do we have to do in order to deter our enemies, to make sure that there is never going to be a second Auschwitz? Ben-Gurion said, I know the solution, but it had to be secret. And in 1961, this is a picture taken in New York. He met with JFK. Everything was done without the knowledge of the Americans. The Americans were suspecting that something was happening in the Negev, in the desert. And JFK turned to Ben-Gurion and said, tell me what's going on in Dimona. What are you guys doing in Dimona? Then don't give me this baloney about textile factory. And Ben-Gurion said, off the cuff, by the way, which is Israel's policy until this very day. He said to him, Mr. President, I can assure you one thing. Israel will not be the first country to introduce nuclear weapons to the Middle East. In other words, he did not confirm, he did not deny, and off the cuff, he said Israel's policy for years to come, until this very day, if you ask any Israeli official whether Israel has operational nuclear capabilities or not, that's the answer you're going to get. And it came from Ben-Gurion in 1961. Israel's defense philosophy is also very unique, and it's also linked to Startup Nation. In order for the enemy to succeed, your attacker to be successful, three preconditions have to exist. Your attacker has to be motivated to attack you. They have to have the weapons to attack you, and they have to have the opportunity to attack you. 9/11 is a perfect example of people that were highly motivated. They had the weapons, the airplanes, and they had the opportunity, which was unsecured airports. And that's when the calamity happens. Now, when you look at cultures and nations and militaries, the way they differ in the emphasis they put on all three elements. If your enemy is motivated but doesn't have the weapons, you're safe. If your enemy has the weapons but doesn't have the opportunity, you're safe. So you can understand the differences in the culture. So some cultures say, we are going to deprive our potential attackers from the opportunity to attack us, right? They send out scores of secret agents to the streets to make sure that the opposition is not doing anything. That's what we call police states. That's the situation in Iran. That's the situation in North Korea. That's the situation in other authoritative regimes. Other nations, many nations, say, we understand that there are people out there motivated to attack us. We understand that we may even give them the opportunity to do it. But our job, for whatever reason, legal reasons, because the Constitution tells us, our job is to find the weapons, to deprive them of the military capability to attack, right? That's what you call in America, in legal terms, the smoking gun, right? We're looking, when you come to the airport in the United States, at least post-COVID-19, they're searching, they're going through your bags. Why? Because they're looking for an object. That's where it's coming from. The philosophy is based on the need to deprive the enemy of the weapon. Israel is unique from a philosophical point of view. Our job is to deprive the enemy of the motivation, meaning the most important thing for us is to identify the motivation. That's why there was such a debate over the Iran deal between Israel and the United States. While the Americans were very happy with stopping the Iranians from producing a bomb, Israel was very unhappy that the agreement did not address the motivation of the regime, what the regime is all about. And it's not just about nuclear weapons, it's about biological warfare. We see now what could happen with just one virus. It's about chemical warfare. It's about conventional warfare. Look at what Iran is doing all over the world without nuclear weapons. So Israel was and still is concerned with the motivation of the regime and not necessarily with the weapons and the weapon systems that the regime is able to develop. And that's really the difference between the United States and Israel on this issue. Israeli approach is an intelligence-based approach. Yes, the Israelis do profile. The American approach is more about the smoking gun, and the police state approach is more about depriving from the opportunity. When you look at the 1948 attackers, the people who tried to destroy us, with Egypt, we have a peace treaty, with Jordan, peace treaty. Syria is experiencing a complete implosion. Lebanon is dysfunctional. Iraq is largely dysfunctional. When you look at the countries that tried to suffocate Israeli economy in 1945, they're lagging far behind Israel's economy today. This is the neighborhood. Look at the neighborhood. I don't want to spend too much time here, but just look at this. This is Egypt. 100 million people, with 20% of the people 15 and above that cannot read or write. And the question that we have to ask ourselves, it's the largest Arab nation in the world, the most important Arab nation in the world. To what extent Egypt can be competitive when 20% of the population cannot read or write? This is the 21st century, and you have to have access to the internet. You have to speak English. You have to know math. Otherwise, there's no way in the world that you could become competitive. I will not go into the aftermath of the so-called Arab Spring. Let me just go very, very quickly to the point I'm trying to make about the origins of the startup nation. And this is really a reason to be optimistic. The first thing is water. And again, a lot of people confuse Israeli creativity with technology. It goes way beyond that. When Israel was founded, the founders of the state of Israel looked at lack of water as the number one existential threat, not necessarily the Arab aggression. And for many years, economists were telling us that desalination, that was known as a technology years before, is not cost effective. And Israeli governments decided against it for many, many years. But about 20 years ago, Israeli governments made a decision to go against the advice of the economists and invest in what they were told is going to increase the price of water. And we established 5 desalination plants along the Mediterranean. Today, Israel is 100% independent, self-sufficient. We produce all the water that we need and more. For example, we give the Jordanians more water than we have to, according to the peace agreement with the Jordanians from 1994. Many of the Syrian refugees along the Jordanian-Syrian border are enjoying water that are provided by Israel to Jordan. Natural gas and oil. You know, Israel was in a clear strategic predicament for many, many years. Israel had to buy natural gas from Egypt. We do have a peace treaty with Egypt, but it was not a good idea to rely on Egypt with such a major and critical strategic matter. And for many, many years, Israel was debating where to get the natural gas from. And then all of a sudden, huge deposits of natural gas and oil were discovered in the Mediterranean. And overnight almost changed the positioning of Israel in a very strategic way, from a country that was an importer of energy to a country that will become very soon an exporter of energy. Population, I already mentioned that. Look at the projection for 2014. Let me tell you, there is no country in the Western world that can show such a chart. There is no such thing. There is no such thing. And again, the fact that we have such a beautiful blend of people and influences and cultures, it's a major engine of Israeli creativity. Life expectancy in 2048 is going to be close to 90. And when you look at the major urban centers, Tel Aviv is going to be 6.3 million people, Haifa 2.8 million, and Jerusalem 1.65 million in 2048. This is according to Israel's Ministry of Finance. And creativity. So again, a lot of people talk about startup nation in the context of technology, but the truth is that Israeli creativity is manifested in all walks of life, from Israeli cuisine to Israeli dance, Israeli music, Israeli sports. Israel is extremely agile and resilient. And one of the reasons that we do that is because Israel has a very high degree of adaptability, the ability to adapt to change. Here's an example. When Israel was founded from 1948 until the French embargo of 1967, the orientation in Israel was clearly European. The dream of every young Israeli was to go to study in Paris. Post-French embargo, and again, this was something that was orchestrated by Yitzhak Rabin, although the decision to turn to America as our main ally was Ben-Gurion's decision, but Yitzhak Rabin as an ambassador, is later on a prime minister, really cemented the ties with the United States. From 1967 until the present, the orientation clearly is American. Every young Israeli's dream is to go to study in America. For the future, I can say that the startup nation is looking at two things: to develop global orientation, meaning establish ties, and we're already very well positioned. Israel is actually primed in that regard. We have an unprecedented level of intimacy with the United States, with Russia, with China, with India, with Brazil, with Nigeria, with Saudi Arabia, with Egypt, with Australia, and I can go on and on and on. Almost every major country in the world. With India, did I mention India? India has wonderful relations. So the future for Israel is beyond the United States, is working with all the big players, and it's already happening, especially when you look at Asia. And that's it. That's my spiel about the origins of the startup nation. I'll be more than happy to answer questions, including questions about my own career. Thank you.
Amazing, Ido. Thank you for this outstanding presentation. And I think for me personally, as an Israeli, but I guess obviously for all the Jews around the world, this kind of information makes us feel very, very proud and satisfied with the achievements, terrific, amazing achievements of such a small country in such a short time as well. Okay, so I will ask some questions about, about this presentation and general questions that I have for you. And I also encourage our audience to add more questions using the chat box. Just write down your question and I will be happy to address them to Ido. Okay, Ido, if I will ask you about one Israeli leader, or maybe two Israeli leaders, who in your opinion contributed the most to Israel becoming what it is today, who would it be? And what's so special about this individual's contribution to Israel?
Well, you saw the series The Last Dance with Michael Jordan? About Michael Jordan. Okay, I urge you to watch it. It's I don't know what's Tal's opinion about it. I thought it was phenomenal. Not that I don't necessarily think, highly of him after watching it, but the show itself was incredible. Same thing I can say about Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion to Israel is what Michael Jordan is to the NBA. He's the modern day Moses. He was not flawless. He had many flaws. He was not a perfect human being, but as Shimon Peres said once, the chances of our people having him at the helm at that particular timing was 1 to a million. Now, why Ben-Gurion was such a great leader, and we haven't had a Ben-Gurion since, because Ben-Gurion was a visionary, because Ben-Gurion was preoccupied with the future. He was very knowledgeable about the past, but he never let the past paralyze him. And he was constant to think in 1945 of the tiny state of Israel, that one day we'll have nuclear weapons. That's only a genius can do that. Only a genius can come up with this idea. To think in 1951 to sell bonds. Yeah, you know what happened here in 1951? There was nothing, absolutely nothing. Just to think about the idea to go to American Jews and tell them, why don't you invest in Israel's future, was brilliant. And he did many other great things. And of course, he wasn't perfect. He made many mistakes. But the more I read about him, the more I am at awe at his brilliance, at his knowledge, at his leadership skills. And unfortunately, when I watched the movie about Ben Gurion a couple of years ago called Ben Gurion Epilogue, which was based on footage from 1968 after he retired. And I watched it in Tel Aviv, I watched it in New York, and I watched it in LA 3 times. In all 3 times, there was people people were standing, there was standing ovation after the movie, and it's a documentary. And I asked myself why people are responding that way to the movie. And the answer was because it wasn't really about Ben Gurion. The movie was about the importance of leadership in today's world. And when you see people like Ben Gurion, that after he retired, he went to live in a small cabin in the desert. He did not fantasize about a penthouse in I don't know where. He went to work in the kibbutz. Then people shed a tear because they look at the kind of leadership we used to have all over the world. And COVID-19, by the way, exposed in a very big way the leadership crisis, the global leadership crisis. With a few exceptions, it's just a horrible crisis. And we can talk about that. There are reasons for it, but COVID-19 just exposed it.
Amazing. Ido, in Israel, although we see all this, all these amazing innovations in high tech, we still have a pretty considerable minorities in the Israeli populations who are not actively part, or what we call in Israel, carrying the burden in the same way as others. And we can relate to the ultra-Orthodox, we can mention the Arabs. What is the future for these minorities, in your opinion, and how does it affect Israel's economy these days?
Yeah, so again, I think the key factor here is technology. Let's talk about the 2 populations that you mentioned. The first is the ultra-Orthodox. What is the problem with the ultra-Orthodox? There are several problems with them, but the biggest problems are the fact that they don't teach their children general studies. As a result, their children don't speak English and they don't do math, so they can't really have access to the internet. And they're not serving in the army, so they cannot integrate into Israeli society because, as much as we have grown, still the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, is your entry ticket into that Israeli collective. The IDF is still the #1 integrator in Israeli society. So when you look at the leadership of the ultra-Orthodox in Israel, it's very old, and biology will do its thing, obviously, and they will be replaced one day by younger people. And by definition, I think that the ultra-Orthodox community will not be able to sustain the bombardment of the information revolution. It's impossible. And you see it in Israel almost on a daily basis. You see how Orthodox people, not just ultra-Orthodox people, but Orthodox people in general, feel that their belief system is being attacked. There's a term in Hebrew called litchazek. Are you familiar with that term? Litchazek, people mitchazkim. And they also externalize their symbols of religiosity. If in the old days they used to have a small yarmulke, now they have put a big yarmulke. They have used modest tzitziot, now they have very long tzitziot. And you ask yourself, why do they feel the need to strengthen themselves, right? Litchazek, because they feel threatened. When I was growing up, and the reason why they feel threatened is because of the information revolution. The information revolution presents an unfamiliar challenge, unprecedented challenge to the religious way of life. Let me give you one example. I was born in 1962. When I was born in Israel, there was nothing was open on the Sabbath. Absolutely nothing. And again, I'm not taking a stand here whether it should be open or not. I'm just stating a fact. When I was growing up, nothing was open on the Sabbath. Not even a restaurant, nothing, absolutely nothing. Today, half of the country is open on the Sabbath. All right, so that's what's going to happen with the ultra-Orthodox. The information revolution, the access to knowledge will push them into the general society, and the ultra-Orthodox in Israel will be forced to be more like the ultra-Orthodox in America, where they just work. You go to Brooklyn and you see the people work. They don't collect any stipends from the state and so on. The Arabs is a challenge as well, but the challenge there comes from a different place. The Arab society is still very much based on the patriarch, although more and more Arab women are going out to get a college degree. Many of them are social workers, pharmacologists, nurses, doctors, teachers. They're not being met with a very high level of tolerance from their spouses. So they get a degree, they go home, and they have a problem with their spouse not allowing them to go to work. Now, when you prevent 51% of the members of your community from working, from becoming part of society, from becoming productive, you're basically impairing your future. So with the Arab society, it's more of a cultural problem. And again, I believe that it will be addressed eventually because of the fact that they're working so closely with the Jewish population, especially in cities like Haifa, Tel Aviv Yafo, and places like Akko, and even in a city like Beersheba, there's a great and healthy interaction between Jews and Arabs that produces wonderful things. And you see wonderful things all the time in Israel in that department.
Are there any other minorities besides those that we just mentioned that you are more concerned with their integration into the Israeli society and their participation in the labor market or in Israeli economy?
Well, we have a huge problem with the Bedouins in the Negev. They're part of the Arab Israeli society, but they see themselves as they do serve in the army, unlike most of the Arabs. And it's important to tell our viewers that the reason why the Arabs do not serve in the army is because of us, not because of them. More and more studies that look at the Arab society discover something very interesting. Many of them, more than 70% of them, are actually very proud to be Israeli. And Israeli Jews are very surprised to hear that.
Agree. Okay, so with your permission, I will scoop for some questions from our audience. Dr. Alex Steinberg would like to know, how do you see the impact of annexation of the Jordan Valley on the security of Israel? A bit off topic.
Yeah, it's, the whole annexation is, it was, I think, Henry Kissinger who once said that Israel has no foreign policy, only domestic policy. So the so-called annexation, which is only going to cause trouble with Jordan, is an idea that was introduced for domestic political reasons. So if you ask me as a former diplomat who spent 3 decades in the Israeli Foreign Service, I can tell you that from a foreign policy point of view, it doesn't make any sense. Domestically, politically, for certain politicians, probably yes, they want to cater to their base. But that's not how you run foreign policy. So it has nothing to do with security, by the way. Israel is secure. We've never been more secure. Zionism has never been stronger than it is today all over the world. All over the world, Zionism has never been stronger than it is today. You've never had more Zionists in America than you have today. We've never had more Jews in Israel than we had today. You know that when Israel was founded in 1948, Ben Gurion was complaining. He said before 1948, we were a nation without a country. Now we are a country without a nation. You know that from 1850 until 1925, 2.3 million Jews left Eastern Europe and came to the United States. 2.3 million. 75 years. It ended with the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act. How many Jews chose to come to Palestine during that time? 75 years. I'll tell you, 80,000. My family among them. Zionism was never a big hit among Jews. Most of them chose America over Palestine.
That's interesting. You know, let's elaborate about this one for a second. So you've been an Israeli diplomat, as you mentioned, for 3 decades, and obviously you've seen it all. And I assume it goes without saying that the general atmosphere and the perception of Israel is very different these days from what it was previously. There is lots of controversy coming mostly, I guess, from the European countries. Some of them obviously related to the never-ending Israeli-Arab conflict. And yet you are saying that we never experienced such a great amount of Zionists all over the world. It seems a bit of a contradiction.
Yeah, I'll tell you more than that. We've never had it better, and we've never had it better than we have it now, State of Israel. Never. Not economically, not militarily, not politically, not look at the intimate relations that we have with all the big countries in the world. Never happened before. I'll tell you more than that. The Palestinian issue is off the table. Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem. You know for how many years I heard warnings that if you will only think about doing that, the entire Middle East will go up in flames. And look, he moved the embassy, nothing happened, really. I mean, there were some riots along the border with Gaza, but nothing really happened. Now, it didn't happen because the Palestinians made every mistake in the book. And they themselves marginalized their own plight. They sidelined themselves. How? By rejecting the Clinton plan in 2000, by the way they reacted to the unilateral pullout from Gaza in the summer of 2005, and by rejecting the Olmert plan in 2008. Olmert was willing to give them 100% of all of their territorial demands. So the world, and certainly the Israelis, are looking at this astonishing series of intransigencies and rejections and asking themselves, wait a second, maybe it's not about territory, maybe it's not about land, maybe it's about something else. Maybe it's about their ongoing refusal to accept our right to exist. And if this is the case, then, you know, that's a whole different conversation. And by the way, to go back to your point about Europe, with the exception of a couple of classic European nations like England and France and Spain, we really don't have a problem in Europe. Most European countries are actually very friendly to Israel. And I'm telling you again, from a foreign policy, and I'm willing to debate every person on this issue, we have never had it better.
So what drives these countries, you know, to boycott or to sign produce from Israel, for instance?
The only boycott that is still in existence is the old 1945 Arab economic boycott. There is no new boycott. Israel is not being boycotted. On the contrary, Israeli businesses are welcomed all over the world. Israel is a magnet for investors, Jews and non-Jews. The largest single investor in Israel's history is a non-Jew, as you all know, Warren Buffett. And I can go on and on and on and share with you information about how Israel today is celebrated, not boycotted, celebrated all over the world. Even Roger Waters, I just published an article about him in the Jerusalem Post last week. even Roger Waters, who's like the poster boy of the BDS movement, is totally shunned by his colleagues, by his peers, and now they won't even let him use the Pink Floyd website. They've had enough of him, the members of the Pink Floyd and the entire community, the entire music industry. So he's been, you know, a PR disaster for the Palestinian cause, by the way. Is bringing them more harm than good.
Interesting. James Bierman would like to know, are you concerned about so-called brain drain occurring in Israel?
Well, that's an excellent question, because before COVID-19, I would have said no. Why no? Because the level of physical mobility was such that it didn't have any meaning. Like, where am I? My brain was on a plane most of the time. So I spent half the time in New York, half the time here. I teach at NYU, I teach at Tel Aviv, I go here, I go there. So people are moving around. I don't know how to answer this question post-COVID-19, because I don't know what will be the impact of COVID-19 on the way we travel. Are we going to be able to travel like we did? I have no idea. If there is not going to be a vaccine, then it will not make any sense. It will be almost impossible to find an effective business model that will allow airlines to function and resume activity if you can not, you know, use the same capacity as before. So I don't know what kind of travel. And physical mobility is the #1 driver of brain drain. In the old days, in the 1970s, if you went to get your PhD from UCLA, chances of you coming back were very, very slim. Why? Because of the distance. It was very difficult. No jobs. Israel was a small country. Today, people go back and forth and they have 5 different jobs. They teach at UCLA, they teach at Tel Aviv, they consult another company in Canada, and they spend every month 1 week in London and so on. And that's been my life until COVID-19. And so it's I don't know the answer. It depends a lot about whether governments will adopt what we call flex economy. Flex economy is the kind of economy that is relying heavily on freelance. It's called gig economy also, is another name for it. When you rely on freelancers, they don't have to be anywhere specific. They can be all over the world. They can work from anywhere. And so the idea of brain drain loses its dramatic impact.
It definitely seems like the global economy is on its way to more a gig and freelance related economy. And obviously, I think that the COVID-19 was also a major accelerator to this process. Okay, so more sports related, Maccabi related question. Shane Carr would like to know, how can the principles of Israeli innovation be applied to sports and propel Israel to become an athletic powerhouse?
The only thing that stands between us and athletic excellence is a decision. No such decision was made, unfortunately. The government is not investing enough in infrastructure. It's, in basketball, it's an anomaly because of the imports. Basketball was brought to Israel twice. The first time, and in both cases, by the way, by the Americans. First time it came via Egypt in the 1950s. The Jews of Egypt came, they learned how to play the game from YMCA and American military coaches. And they brought the game to Israel. And then the 1960s, Tal and his peers brought the game from the United States. They brought the game, not just the game, the professionalism that came with it, the work ethics, the excellence, all the things that we had to learn, right? So Tal Brody is an icon, not only because he won the championship in '77, but because he brought with him level of professionalism that Israelis were not familiar with. And so in basketball, it's an anomaly Israel is doing well because of the import. But the problem is soccer. The problem is swimming. The problem is track and field. We're not investing enough. In soccer, it's a shanda that Israel was in the World Cup in 1970, and since then we're unable to repeat that achievement. It's something that cannot be explained, other than that the government hasn't made the decision to invest enough resources in this. And there's no way in the world, a country like Croatia is doing so well. Sweden, also 9 million people, doing so well. There's no reason in the world for us not to excel in soccer as well, in football. But it's not happening.
So we are waiting.
Maybe Tal has his own opinion on this.
That would be nice to hear, Tal, if you can unmute yourself. And first of all, thank you for joining us today. It's a huge privilege to have you here.
Oh, and expanding what Ido has said, it's first of all, it's an honor to hear Ido. I have heard him many times, and every time it's more interesting. And what he said is very true. Actually, expanding on what was just heard, in our minor sports, which you would consider minor, that don't get the publicity. But when I saw the flag being raised in Abu Dhabi, when Moki received the gold medal, it was something amazing. I mean, imagine in Abu Dhabi, first of all, that an Israeli judo team was invited. And not only invited, to hear the Hatikva and to have an Israeli get up on the podium is amazing. Now, also our rhythmic, that's in judo. In judo, we're very successful. Our girls in judo are amazing. 3 world championships, starting with Yael Arad and Yarden Jarbi, and now with Moki in Abu Dhabi, but with rhythmic gymnastics, the immigration from Russia, we're one of the top 10 in the world, which is amazing. What Ido said, they need more conditions, how they're training and more training camps, and they're not supported with a large financial background. If you see some of the places where they're training in judo, you wouldn't even go into some of these places if you go into the locker rooms and see what's after your training. But they're doing great. In gymnastics itself, we're one of the best in the world. And in in basic, in the sports you don't hear about. In the newspaper where it's literally written, soccer, the whole pages today are full with soccer because the league is getting back. So yes, that's true. The governmental support, even though it has raised through the years, but still it doesn't compare to what the budgets of Europe is putting out for sport facilities and for backing all their professional teams. I do like to say something about the Maccabi. It's amazing for me to see how the Maccabi games have grown. And it's not any less important as birthright and, like nefesh to nefesh, that's bringing thousands of people all through the years. But when I came with the Maccabi games, there was only 25 countries and 1,250 athletes when Mark Spitz and I led the American delegation. In the last Maccabi that we had over 10,000 Jewish athletes and close to 80 countries. Now, for every youth that's coming to Israel in the Maccabi games, in one of those 80 countries, and for the first time that he's putting his feet on Israel, it's an experience for him that never in his life that he thought about, as I never thought about, would happen. I mean, what happened to me happens to many in the Maccabi games. And those that don't make immigration to Israel are just important as those that do. The smaller numbers that make immigration to Israel because they're going back to their communities and they're standing up for Israel. They have a base, they have a love in their heart after those Maccabi games to go back and to stand up against the BDS movements or anti-Semitism or what they hear around them. And it gives them that base. And that's our front line that we need today in Israel, because Ido very rightly said that we can take care of ourselves here and what's going on around us. But we need those frontline people, and that's what the Maccabi games are doing. Okay, when you come to Israel, the Israeli sports writers, they don't relate to, they want to see a Usain Bolt, they want to see a Michael Jordan in all the competitions. They don't look at it, the importance of every Jewish athlete. And people in the world, they don't know that the only non-Jewish athletes are basically Arab Israelis that participate because they're citizens of Israel in the Maccabi games. So the Maccabi games should not be taken lightly and not to be underestimated. And I have taken that journey, and I saw the growth and I saw the importance of the games up to today, and I'll still see it until my time has come.
Yeah. Every word.
Thank you.
And thank you for this insight, Tal. And we definitely, all of us, look forward, to meet again at the Maccabi games, although they were postponed by a year. And yet I think we should all be optimistic that we will meet again in even bigger and larger numbers of delegations and participants, and to be able to present to the whole country of Israel this amazing project, this amazing achievement. Okay, so I'm trying to be respectful with the schedule. We still have some more questions. But though I will try to wrap it up. Okay, Jared, as of right now, Israel is the only true democracy in the Middle East. How can or will Israel maintain this level of democracy and perhaps spread democracy in the Middle East during these times of innovative and technological growth? And I will piggyback with these questions, this question also asking about maybe the water as the main component, as the most valuable commodity that is going to be in the next year, and how is that going to be to impact the geopolitics of the Middle East? If you can a bit elaborate about this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. The water has been the reason for conflicts all over throughout civilization. The combination of creativity and problems can build bridges. I believe that the information revolution and more specifically in the introduction of the first smartphone in 2007 is the defining moment. Why? Because the smartphone is allowing all of us to self-design our own informational environment, which means that my feed is by definition different than your feed, and every feed is very individual and very personal. And if it's not in our feed, it doesn't exist. It's very, very important to understand. It's the only explanation as to why pre-COVID-19 tourism to Israel was going up 7 years in a row, unrelated to the geopolitics of the region. In other words, things can go wrong between bilateral players, right? Israel can have a conflict with Jordan. But at the same time that the governments are having a quarrel, the people themselves can communicate with each other. And that's what we're seeing now. During COVID-19, we all experience what scientists call hyperconnectivity, meaning we were connected digitally like never before. And that hyperconnectivity is allowing me to sit here outside of Jerusalem and to chat with you in San Diego, or to chat with you in New York, or to chat with you in Australia. It doesn't matter where you are. So that has, it's a tremendous statement about the power of technology to change the world. And it's already happening. Sometimes the implications are disastrous. Look at what's happening. One incident in Minneapolis inflamed the whole nation. But in other cases, technology and the spread of knowledge is helping to save lives, just like what we had with COVID-19. Very quickly, technology allowed people to gain insight and gain access to the right kind of behavior that is expected of them in order to protect themselves and to protect others. That's very valuable. So I believe the same thing ultimately will happen in the Middle East, because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. Every person wants to have, the basic fundamentals of good life. Every person wants to have some education. Every person wants to be able to make a living. Every person wants to have some level of stability and safety and certainty, and so on and so forth. So I believe that that common desire will probably at the end will prevail. We are right now in a transition period, right? The newly self-designed informational feeds have been around for less than 2 decades. And so we're only at the beginning of the revolution. So I'm very, very optimistic about the impact of technology on our lives.
Sorry, I was muted. I was talking to myself. Ido, unfortunately, our time is up, and it was
wait, before you conclude, I see that Dr. Sternberg wrote something about Nate Holtzman introduced what in 1949 to President Truman?
No idea. Maybe Dr. Steinberg can relate.
Alex, can you? Because I'm curious.
Nat Holman was sent by President Truman to introduce basketball to Israel in 1949.
Oh.
The legendary Nat Holman, who used to be the president of Maccabi USA. So I just wanted to, it's a minor point, but he was, I think, to my knowledge, the first one that introduced the sport of basketball to the newly emerging state of Israel.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you, Alex.
The American military used to travel with coaches, and also the Peace Corps used to teach basketball and baseball wherever they went. So that's how the sport, baseball and basketball specifically, in Egypt, thanks to the U.S. military, was a very good. Okay. They had a wonderful national team in the 1950s, and I don't know if they're still good, but they used to be very good.
But let me just add on a point that Nat Holman I saw when he was in Israel, but not in 1949, a little bit later. But basketball in general was their, let's say like Yeshua Rosen and Hemel, they came from Egypt. Now Maccabi, when it was, the team was started about 1932, the first games that they would take a train from Rehovot to Egypt to play against the Alexandria team. And they would take a tender and go up to Lebanon and to play against a Lebanese team. And then Maccabi went forward. And as the basketball in the state of Israel was created, you're right, Nat Holman came. And then it was Davison. There was a few American coaches after, and Nat Holman with the Maccabi USA, he continued that momentum. Yes, for sure, definitely. I remember Nat Holman. I remember him.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see that Egypt even was able to send some players to the NCAA and to. I remember. A guy who played for Duke, Abdel Nabi, was Egyptian, played in the 1980s. Yeah.
Okay. Ido, gentlemen, it was a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much
for your time. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
I think it's also worth mentioning that June the 4th, you will be hosting a panel of several distinguished individuals, and the topic of this conversation will be the future of sports. I highly recommend and encourage our audience to sign up for this conversation as well. We already have roughly 200 people registered for this session as well, so it's going to be very well attended. there are so many questions and that I wanted to ask you, and we didn't even touch all your all these different stories and the topic of your service as a diplomat and the foreign affairs related to Israel. I hope that you will agree to be my guest maybe on one of the next episodes of Café Israeli. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It was great to see you, Lou, Alex, and all the attendees. Thank you so much for joining me today. Have a great day. Take care. Shalom.
Shalom.